Okay, good morning, everyone. Look, we might kick off. Thanks for joining us this morning for webinar 3 in our series, which is effectively introduction to bridge assessments and also making that connection through to our heavy vehicle access decision-making process. So thank you for joining us. If I could just ask you to mute your microphone if you haven't already, so that way we can avoid any feedback. So just a quick recap, and particularly for those of you who haven't joined us on the previous 2 webinars, you'll see here we're up to number 3, Bridge Assessment Framework, and Dr. Neil Lake will be taking you through that particular focus of this webinar. And as you can see there, we've got a few more that will follow this particular series. The next one there is on Thursday, but by all means, if you haven't seen the first 2 webinars, please go back and watch them in order. We are making them available to you. They're not there yet, but they'll soon be available, so you can watch those ones. Very quickly, just a couple of introductions. Todd Wellard is my name. I'm the project manager for the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project. And joining me today, as I just mentioned, Dr. Neil Lake, Director of Engineering Practice at IPWEA Queensland, and Neil will do an intro when he kicks off his session around the assessment framework. So just very quickly, the agenda for today, just a quick welcome. We'll get into having a look at the tiers of assessment. This is really important in terms of the distinction from tiers as opposed to levels of inspection, which you might be familiar with in terms of how you manage your assets. So very important that we understand those fundamental principles there, and then having a look at the bridge assessment framework that we've developed and that we're working with here. So I think that's really important, understanding some of those key points around there in terms of how that framework's being implemented here through the project. And then assuming that we've got some time at the end, a bit of a Q&A. So any questions, but look, what we might do, if you've got any questions, if you wouldn't mind just dropping them into the chat as we go through, and we'll try to get to those time permitting at the end of the session. Otherwise, we'll follow up with those afterwards. So I've just covered off that one. Please mute your microphones, as I said just before, so we don't get any of that feedback. As I said, we're recording all the sessions, and they will be made available to you very soon, and will be emailed with the slides. And as I said, make sure you watch them in order, because we build the content as we go, and it'll just help cement some of those concepts and understandings. All right, so look, that's probably enough in terms of the intro. Oh, one final thing to mention. So I've talked previously about trying to build a set of resources for road managers around this whole bridge assessment space. So we've got the Road Manager Toolkit, which we're currently building, and these webinars make up a part of that. But the framework which Neil is talking to today, and a number of other things will go into making up that toolkit, which will be available to yourselves and other road managers beyond the time frame of the project. You'll see there on the right-hand side, that is the project website. So this is on what we call the engagement hub. If you haven't already registered, please jump in and do so, and you'll get access to the Road Manager Toolkit within that particular site. So really great resource for road managers, and as I said, we're building that over time. The only other thing I'll mention just before we go, just so you're aware, and it should have popped up on your screen at the beginning, we are recording these sessions, and obviously that's so that we can utilise them post this, so when we put the videos up online, so that you can look at them in the future. All right, that's more than enough from me. Let's jump to the important stuff and over to Neil. So Neil, I'll hand over to you to talk about the Bridge Assessment Framework.
Yeah, thanks very much, Todd. Yeah, just a little bit of brief background on myself. I work for IPWEA in Queensland, the Institute of Public Works and Engineering, and my background in heavy vehicle assessment, for those who haven't been on the earlier webinars, my background, I've worked in this heavy vehicle assessment area for, well, I guess most of my career, pretty intensely over the last 10 or 15 years, but my background goes back 25 years in this particular area. In my very early days, testing bridges, going around putting bits of instrumentation on bridges. That was 25 years ago. So it's a pretty interesting field, and it's really great to be able to share some of this knowledge with the folk out there. It's a pretty testing area to try and get your head around. and hopefully we can get to distill some of the I guess I'd say basic elements. Maybe they're not so basic, but the fundamental building blocks of how we go about doing heavy vehicle access assessment. So I'm just going to turn my video off now, because I think in the last webinar it was freezing a lot. So I'll just talk to the slides if that's okay. So what do we want to achieve today? So the key things that I really want to go through is start to understand, I guess, what the various tiers of assessment that are used within Australia. And it's important to understand that the terminology that's used throughout Australia can vary quite significantly. And it's important to get across that. So I do want to cover that. Importantly, I really want to stress the difference between bridge assessment and heavy vehicle access assessment. The two things, while they can use similar processes, that sort of thing, they are very different things. And it's very important, I think, that we understand what those are, and I want to cover that off in today's session. And lastly, I want to go through the framework that was developed as part of this strategic local government assessment program, and I want to just take you through some of the key issues in that. There's a lot of information there on that framework to help guide people through the process of dealing with heavy vehicle access requests and the processes that you need to do in order to be able to do that. But I want to take you through a couple of key elements, and I'll leave you to read the rest a little bit later on. So hopefully that sort of summarises what we want to go through today. Now, the first thing I wanted to start with is, what are the tiers of bridge assessment? And in Australia, typically, it's most common to think of the tiers of assessment as there being 3 tiers of assessment. Now, some jurisdictions or road managers might have different levels. They might have 4 levels, but usually 3 would be the minimum. And so I'm going to talk more generally in terms of, what's commonly thought of in the industry as being the different tiers. The tiers of assessment are usually progressive in terms of cost and complexity. But it's important to understand that the tiers of assessment are not necessarily things that you would conduct one after the other. It's quite common for that to occur, but generally what tier of assessment that you select depends on the context and what you're actually trying to achieve. So we'll go through a bit of that. Just a quick comment that I just wanted to make. With these 3 tiers of assessment, it's often thought that Tier 1 assessment is very conservative or not very accurate, and that, if you don't get good results with the Tier 1 assessment, then you definitely need to go to higher tiers of assessment. And I just wanted to address that and dispel that myth. Really, the accuracy of Tier 1 assessment really depends on the quality of the reference vehicles that you have. And we'll get into that a little bit today, but a lot more in the webinar on Thursday on what reference vehicles are and how they work and what's the appropriate selection of them. And because what's really important is that the selection of those reference vehicles is really important for the validity of Tier 1 assessment. But if you do have good, accurate and valid reference vehicles, then Tier 1 assessment can be very, very accurate. And so I just wanted to really dispel that myth that Tier 1 assessments are inherently conservative. Depends on the quality of the reference vehicles that we use to define our bridge capability, which I've touched on already, and we'll keep on defining and hopefully develop our understanding over the coming webinars and some of what we'll address today. Already touched on that. The terminology varies quite widely in Australia. We'll go over that. So as I said, there's 3 tiers of assessment, and this just puts it into a nice little graphic. I'm going to cover little bits of this as we go along today, but I just wanted to give this overall representation. We sort of have Tier 1 assessment on the left-hand side, and that's essentially comparing a heavy vehicle that's requesting our access with whatever we believe the bridge capability to be, defined by a vehicle. And that side of the equation, we're talking about heavy vehicle access assessment. We're comparing vehicles that want access to vehicles that we already know are okay to cross the structure. And as we move to the right-hand side, we're talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 assessment. These are getting into things, Tier 2 is capacity assessment. So this is a similar process to what we would use in design. And we have design standards that we would use that, generally the AS5100 suite. AS5100 Part 7 guides a lot of that. That's the section on evaluation of structures. But there are many other sub-elements in that code that you would use if, say, if you're assessing concrete or steel. These are all different parts of the code. Tier 3 assessment, that's more specific. There's another code that we could use for that as well, AS13822. And then we've got the asset improvement report. That's not really tiers of assessment. That's when you sort of decide that you're a bit out of options to do any more particular work. And you might try and see, well, what's the best way forward with the structure? So let's talk about Tier 1 assessment, right? So Tier 1 assessment, the way that I would describe it, we're not doing bridge assessment here. That's what the big note on the bottom is all about. This is not bridge assessment. What we are doing in Tier 1 assessment is that we are assessing a heavy vehicle and we're determining whether it would be suitable for access to a structure. Of all the tiers of assessment, this is the simplest method, and it's a pretty basic sort of approach. What we do is we compare a reference vehicle that we run across a line model. I'll go through this in more detail. We determine some load action effect from that, and this defines what our bridge capability is. What's the biggest vehicle that can cross the structure, which we've covered in earlier webinars. And we compare that bridge capability to an application vehicle. And we do that using a line model and looking at the line model load action effects. We'll look at that in a bit more detail. So what we're effectively doing is comparing moment, shear, and support reaction. Those are the three main parameters that we compare on that line model. Now, it accounts for the configuration and articulation of the bridge, which we covered last week. So we talked about in the last webinar, we talked about simple support, and we talked about continuous structures where, you know, the superstructure is joined together, allowing us to get moments over the top of piers. One of the key advantages of Tier 1 assessment is that it's fairly simple and it can be performed in-house with limited bridge design and assessment experience. I think I can just hear someone that might not have a mic muted. So if you could just ensure that your mics are muted, I really appreciate that. And so what's important is that the accuracy of Tier 1 assessment really depends on the appropriateness and the accuracy of the reference vehicles that we're using in the assessment. And I've got in there in brackets percentage of reference vehicles. So often people think of a reference vehicle as being a particular vehicle, you know, whatever it's loaded to. But what's important to understand is that, you know, we can do assessment on those vehicles at a more detailed level, and you could come up with some percentage of that vehicle that's okay to cross a structure. So it's important to think of those reference vehicles as this percentage of reference vehicles because they could vary. Right, so that's what Tier 1 assessment is in a nutshell. Tier 2 assessment is a little bit different. Now we're getting into the realm of the sort of processes that we would use when we typically design a bridge. And when we do that, what we actually do is we look at the individual capacities of members and we compare them to the loading actions that we think would occur in those particular members. So by individual members, I mean each individual girder, I mean, you know, segments of the slab, I mean the headstock and the piers. All those things are looked at an individual level. It uses the structural engineering principles to identify these maximum loading effects, and the capacities are calculated for each of these individual members using the different material properties and the configurations of the bridge. Now, typically when we do this sort of assessment, we do two-dimensional analysis, particularly of the superstructure. And typically what we employ in this case is a grillage analysis, which we can see, in the figure on the bottom right. That's sort of what we idealize the structure into a series of beams in both the longitudinal and transverse directions. And we then analyze the loads on that to work out what the loads would be in the individual members. Typically then we evaluate those members using AS5100 or other subparts of AS5100, and we use load factors, capacity reduction factors, all the typical things that we'd use in design. A point that I just wanted to make, when we're actually evaluating a structure using a Tier 2 assessment sometime after it's been designed, then I think it's generally a good idea to think about how the structure is actually being used. So I would generally encourage people strongly to use marked lanes instead of design lanes. Now, so by marked lanes, I mean, where the lanes are marked on the road, because that's where, vehicles will be running. When we design structures, we take a more fundamental theoretical approach, and we consider the bridge as design lanes. The use of the bridge could change over time. And so often what we do is we would jam design lanes right against the edge. We would, if the road was earmarked to have, 2 lanes, but, maybe in the future it could have 3 or 4, the bridge might be wider. So when we design a bridge, we consider 4 lanes. But if that's not how it's currently being used, then we have an opportunity for Tier 2 assessment to really consider how the structure is being used. And so in that case, we're talking about using marked lanes. I guess what's important about that whole process is that if the use of the structure changes in the future, then we need to think about changing our Tier 2 assessment, because how we use the structure is different. So it's just something to keep in mind as we go through. So in Tier 2 assessment, generally you would hear people refer to this as capacity assessment, because we're assessing the capacity of individual elements. What's really important is that condition must be considered, right? You really shouldn't be doing a Tier 2 assessment unless you understand the condition of your structure. And the fundamental building blocks of that, as I've said before in previous webinars, is the level 2 condition inspection, which is pretty predominant throughout Australia, using a 1 to 4 rating. And as I've said in previous webinars, it's really critical as an asset owner that you are conducting these level 2 inspections. They're the fundamental building blocks of your asset management process, and really important in terms of showing, due diligence in terms of looking after your assets. So it's the fundamental thing that you have to start with. You shouldn't be doing Tier 2s without level 2 inspections. Doing them from just a pure theoretical point of view is not particularly useful. We need to understand how the structure is actually able to perform in terms of resisting those loads that come across, and condition is the fundamental building block of understanding that. Now, in undertaking Tier 2 assessment, I really want to stress that it is really important that anyone that's undertaking this kind of work has some significant bridge design or assessment experience, that they have appropriate software, and that there's appropriate engineering oversight. It's not the sort of task that, as a local road authority, you can just decide, oh, I want to do some Tier 2 assessment. I'll get the graduate to go and have a look at that, when they have no background in bridges. Bridge engineering is quite a specialised field. It's really important that the person that's overseeing has enough experience to understand, whether the methods that are being used are appropriate. And really that understanding is not going to come. There's no textbooks out there that you can easily just go and look at. And generally you would need to have a background in this, somewhere 5 to 10 years, to be overseeing this kind of work. And so the reality is, for most road authorities, that you would really need to be going out to a supplier, to a consultant, to do this kind of work. But what's really important in the process, you know, as an asset owner, is that you understand how to actually procure those services. And a lot of the stuff that we talk about in these webinars will help you to gain some of that understanding, to do good requests for quotes, so that, you know, you can get what you need, so that you can actually do that heavy vehicle access assessment that we've talked about as being so critical here. So a key outcome from a Tier 2 assessment, there's a couple of different ways when you use the AS5100 Part 7 that you can express the outcomes from an assessment. One, you can just look at the, you know, the percentage of the capacity that's used, which includes live loads and dead loads. But there's another way that it can be expressed, and that's in terms of this rating factor, which I've put up there on the screen. And what the rating factor is essentially is a ratio of the available capacity, bridge capacity for traffic live load effects over the traffic load effects of the vehicle that you're rating, right? And so when you do that, you'll end up with a thing called a rating factor. And essentially what I wanted to link this into is that I talked a little bit earlier about having good reference vehicles, and that those reference vehicles could be considered a percentage of a reference vehicle. And essentially that's what the rating factor is. So, you know, if you had a semi-trailer that's being rated and the rating factor came out at 0.8, that means that 0.8 of that semi-trailer going across the structure could be safely taken. And so essentially that percentage of reference vehicle now is 0.8 of a semi-trailer, right? The 0.8 is the percentage. It's also equivalent to the rating factor. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but it's an important concept to start to get across, and hopefully I've done that some justice there. But of course, if you've got any questions, please just pop them in the chat and we can come back to them. Well, what's important with all of this work is that when you look at it, you've got to sit down, think about it, and then ask some questions, and we're definitely here to help from that point of view. So when we undertake a Tier 2 assessment, obviously we could do a Tier 2 assessment on a particular vehicle that wants access to a structure. But there are a number of issues with doing that. First of all, obviously, the Tier 2 assessment is extremely expensive, so we can't rate every structure. And so what I think, we can't rate every vehicle that wants access. So I think that a key output of any Tier 2 assessment should be around developing an understanding of the bridge capability. And by bridge capability, what I mean is a suitable set of reference vehicles that we could use for Tier 1 assessment. And of course, from the previous slide, our percentage of reference vehicle, that's one of the key outcomes of a Tier 2 assessment. So if we do that for a number of useful vehicles, we can build up this picture of what the bridge capability is, and we can use that in our comparative Tier 1 assessments down the track. Now, one really, really important point in Tier 2 assessment, and practice does vary around Australia, but I think this is a really important point. When you do Tier 2 assessment, what you have is your main vehicle that you're considering, and you also need to put vehicles in the other lanes as well. Now, those vehicles in the other lanes are called associated vehicles or associated lane vehicles. What's really important is that those vehicles are identical to the main assessment vehicle. Right, now that is a really important concept. A lot of people think about this in terms of, well, you know, the normal vehicle that runs on this route, say, is a semi-trailer. So I'll use a semi-trailer in those other lanes, and I will use whatever vehicle I'm considering in the primary lane. And this is fraught with a lot of issues potentially, and I don't really want to get into it in a lot of detail at the moment. But when you have the same vehicle in both lanes, then you are in a position where you can scale results, and means that tier 1 assessment is directly valid. It's directly usable, right? As soon as you have a different vehicle in the underlane, it gets a lot more complicated. And one of the key issues that can prop up is that sometimes you can allow access at a higher level than is actually appropriate. And what can happen down the track is that lots of vehicles start applying at that higher level, and you keep approving it, and then suddenly the predominant vehicle that's on the route is no longer a semi-trailer. Instead, it's a B triple or a B double or whatever vehicle has decided that, you know, hey, this is a really great route to be using. And then you could find yourself in a position where suddenly those assessments don't work anymore. And so I think that's really important, because what it does allow is ensures equity of access, and it ensures that you don't have to retrospectively revoke access, and it ensures that you know, your tier 1 assessment, the scalability of that process is valid. All right, so let's move on to the next tier of assessment. That's a tier 3 assessment. I've described that here as capacity assessment plus. And basically, tier 3 assessment is the catch-all for everything else, pretty much. And it covers a very wide range of activities that can be undertaken. And there are particular times when you would undertake a tier 3 assessment, and that's often when, you know, you do something like a tier 2 assessment and, you know, the results might come back substandard for various reasons. And if you went out and visited that site and had a look at it, and you look at your level 2 inspection, condition inspection information, the structure may actually appear in really great condition. There doesn't look like there's been any issues with it. And when that happens, what we generally are identifying is something called a plausibility gap. And by that, it means that, you know, the theoretical assessment perhaps is not reflecting what's happening in reality. And there are instances where tier 3 assessment can be used to address that plausibility gap. It's a very tricky area, and, you know, it's very specialized skill set that's needed for this kind of work. So sometimes we do tier 3 assessment when we don't have enough information to conduct tier 2. Sometimes we do a tier 3 assessment when we believe that we could get a better outcome by understanding the behavior of a structure more, understanding the behavior of a structure better. And it could allow us to change some of those factors that we'd use in tier 2 assessment. So I guess essentially what tier 3 assessment is about is making our assessment processes much more site specific. So by that I mean, you know, really understanding the context of a particular structure. Something that I just wanted to touch on here, though, is that a common thing that I hear people saying all the time is like, we get a substandard result in tier 2, and they go, "Oh, that's all right, we'll just do a tier 3, and that'll give us a better result." And I just wanted to, again, that's another myth, you know, that I wanted to dispel. In some circumstances, a tier 3 is a great idea because it could produce results that are potentially better. But it's also important to really be consulting people with a lot of experience in tier 3s, because there is actually a good chance that tier 3s might not give you the answer that you want. It's also important to understand that a tier 3 might not be able to achieve the goal that you want. So, for instance, commonly people would say, "Oh, if we don't have drawings, then we need to do a tier 3 assessment." But in actual reality, there are limitations in what you can do with tier 3. You know, to actually understand what reinforcement is in a structure, you know, the non-destructive techniques that we have only work in certain circumstances. You know, we can't just take an X-ray of a structure and then we know exactly what's in there, right? There are limitations to all of these techniques. And it's really important that we understand those before we go and spend what can be quite a considerable amount of money on tier 3 investigation. I touched a little bit on dynamic load allowance in one of the earlier webinars where, I was saying that, doing some testing on it won't necessarily get you the answer that you want. Well, this is another good example of where tier threes, while they might be very expensive, they might actually give you more questions rather than answers. So it's important that you're talking to someone with a lot of experience in this area as to whether, you think that you can get to the outcome. The last thing that I just wanted to particularly cover off on that with tier 3 assessments is that you would only undertake tier 3 assessments if you plausibly think that you could get to a better answer. And so, we shouldn't be just using tier 3 assessments because tier 2's not giving the answer or tier 1s are not giving us the answer. We really need to be sure that we have the potential to get to an answer. For instance, if you've got very substandard rating factors that might be extremely low, and that we know with that type of structure that no matter what investigation we can do, we're not going to get to the point, where we get a better outcome. Well, there's not much point spending more money on it. And that's why, I think it's important, and one of the myths that I was trying to dispel earlier, while the tiers of assessment increase in complexity, they don't necessarily follow each other. You don't necessarily do a tier 1, then a tier 2, then a tier 3. The selection of all the tiers is based on the context and where you actually sit at the time. Making the best use of our funds, essentially, at the end of the day. So tier 3 assessment, there's a whole bunch of different things that we could do. Here are a couple of examples. Could be invasive, non-invasive inspections of components. We could be looking at methods that are used in overseas standard. We could assess to AS ISO 13822, which is a code that really looks at, some of more around the probabilities of things occurring, but it also allows you to think about assessment more in terms of a business case, and really brings in this idea of managing risks along the way as well. We could do some testing to understand, the material capabilities, characteristics. Often the compressive strength is much stronger than what we initially thought, or what was designed. So on a drawing, when we specify a strength of concrete, well, this is a lower bound that we use when we design, but the actual strength of concrete might be much higher. But again, there are instances when it makes sense to do some testing around that, and there are instances when it doesn't. For instance, if we have the compressive, strength of concrete, if it was higher, it really doesn't make much difference to our bending capacity of structures because the concrete strength doesn't make that much difference to that. But on the other hand, if we're thinking about shear, it could make quite a big difference. Or if we're thinking about axle load in a column, it also can make quite a big difference. So understanding that context is really important. We could also use tier 3 assessment to understand the sorts of loads that are going across the structure. Could be weigh and motion, that could be measurement of bridges to understand the loads. Yeah, there's lots of different things that tier 3 assessment could include. So we've covered off on the tiers of assessment. Now, I just wanted to cover a little bit of the variations in terminology that occur throughout Australia. So you can see on the right-hand side, I've got their bridge asset owners tiers of assessments. And we have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 assessment. Now, as I've described the tiers of assessment that we've talked about today, these are the official tiers of assessment that have been agreed to by road authorities and published in an Austroads note, which you can get, by the way. Any of the Austroads reports are freely available to anyone. You just need to create a login, and there's lots of great stuff in there that could be useful to you that you can download. So just a quick plug for Austroads there. So those tier 1, 2, 3, that's the Austroads definitions. Now, there is variation in that. A good example perhaps is TMR, where their tier 1 assessment they actually call a tier 0, and a tier 1 is equivalent to a tier 2, and then a tier 2 is equivalent to a tier 3. So it's really important when you're talking to people, particularly say suppliers, when you're trying to get a particular tier of assessment done. If that consultant has been based in Queensland and they've done a lot of work for TMR, they might be using the terminology of Tier 1 assessment, meaning, a structural assessment AS 5100, a capacity assessment, which in the definitions that I went through was a Tier 2 assessment. So it's something to really keep in mind when you're going. So what's important is that when you say Tier 2, you actually describe what you mean. Or if you say Tier 3, you describe what you mean. I think that's important. Now, the other big variation that occurs is that in the PBS guidelines, there is also bridge assessment tiers within that documentation. And it's really important to also understand that they do also vary compared to the bridge asset owners tiers of assessment. So, a Tier 1 assessment in the PBS guidelines is meeting the bridge formula, which we're not covering in this webinar series. A Tier 2 assessment is basically, it describes in a PBS assessment, must not cause effects greater than the existing commercial vehicles. That essentially is a Tier 1 assessment, right? So a Tier 1 bridge owner's asset assessment is similar to a Tier 2 assessment in the PBS line. Tier 3 PBS assessment, detailed individual bridge assessment, what they're really referring to there is a Tier 2, structural assessment using, the capacity of the structure. So again, yeah, important to understand the terminology and think about who you're talking to make sure that you have a common terminology. I would encourage everyone to really stick to the tiers of assessment that were agreed to by Austroads, which is what's been presented in this program, and it's also the terminology that we're using in the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Program. Importantly, I just want to make that distinction again, that we have this idea of vehicle assessment versus bridge capacity assessment. So all of the elements in the bottom half, that's bridge capacity assessment. That is what we're talking about when we say we're doing bridge assessment. All the stuff on the top in the light red colour, what we're talking about there is heavy vehicle access assessment. Essentially, we're doing comparison of vehicles. In the bottom, we're actually assessing structures. So it's an important distinction between the two. All right, so let's talk about the framework for tiers of assessment that was developed as part of this Strategic Local Government program. It's actually quite similar to a process that was developed as part of an Austroads project that was called Higher Order Assessment in Australia, which I authored along with various other co-authors. And it's an adaptation of that and really more comprehensive. And I think that this diagram really puts it together quite well. I'm not going to go through all of the details in here, but there's a lot of very good information in one sheet. So, you'll get these slides. I encourage you to print this out, put it in a nice big, A3 size so that you can refer to it. But it takes you through the process of when is it appropriate to do the different tiers of assessment. A couple of key things that I just want to go through, and there's some of the very early boxes that we would go through in this flow diagram. The first one is that the very first diamond is level 2 inspection, right? And you can see there that if you don't have one, the very first step that you have to do is to perform one, because all tiers of assessment, bridge assessment, any form of access assessment for heavy vehicles, you must have current condition, an understanding of current condition to proceed. If you don't have it, you need to do it. You can't just do these things from a theoretical point of view. So I really just want to, again, strongly emphasize that point. The second point that I wanted to make is that the real split off between whether you do higher tiers of assessment versus tier 1 really comes down to, do you have appropriate reference vehicles to compare any vehicle requesting access to. Now, if you don't have appropriate reference vehicles, well, then you can get funneled off onto the higher order tiers of assessment. If you do have it, then you can go down the very straightforward path of doing Tier 1 assessment. Now, in the webinar that I do on Thursday, I will talk a bit about what is an appropriate reference vehicle when we start to detail Tier 1 assessment in much more detail. And I really want to hone in on Tier 1 assessment because this is the assessment that, as a local asset owner, local road authority, this is the thing that you really need to start to get au fait with and start to understand so that you can actually make decisions on those heavy vehicle access requests. The next thing that I just wanted to touch on here is that design drawings are absolutely critical in the process of assessing bridges. And now I do understand that in most local authorities there are issues with drawings and keeping them over time. But I just want to make the point that those drawings are absolute gold in this whole process. And without them, everything becomes much, much more difficult and sometimes almost impossibly difficult. So we need to start using judgment instead of using, engineering principles to make decisions. So I just encourage local asset owners to really think about drawings as being, the sacred piece of information on every asset. We see instances where, very recent structures no one can locate drawings for, or you can only locate a tender set for or something. It's really critical that, you have documented what's actually was intended to be constructed and then what actually was constructed. These are really, really important. And I think another critical issue is that, we're moving to a digital age more and more. And so what we see often is that, drawings can be scanned in, but no one's checking whether or not the scan is legible. And we've seen many, many instances where we have drawings, but nothing is readable on the drawing. And then those drawings get destroyed. And all we've got is an illegible scan, which, does provide us with some info, but not the critical stuff that we actually need. So I'd encourage everyone to really think about that in terms of, collecting data and managing that data moving forward. All right, so I think I'll leave you to have a look at that. And of course, we're available for any questions on that. I don't think there's much point going through this in more detail because some of the concepts we'll cover in more detail in other webinars. I just wanted to cover off on some critical points. We're just wrapping up here. So the question that comes, why don't you just do higher tiers of assessment for each heavy vehicle application? Now, I have touched on this, but I just want to cover it again. The reason why we can't do that is because Tier 2 assessment is very expensive. Anywhere between a typical range would be between $5,000 and $20,000 for a Tier 2 assessment. Now that amount could go up drastically if you're talking about, very, unique long span bridges. But typical bridges, that would be the typical range that you would have. It's also important to understand the computation time that it takes to do that is long, and we get lots of heavy vehicle access requests. Now, that's even the case if you had some form of rapid Tier 2 assessment, which has been sort of promoted in the industry for quite a while. But the issue is that there's long computation time, so assessments can't be done that quickly. So, this process of Tier 1 assessment is really the way forward, I think, for heavy vehicle access assessment. And I think also what's important is we don't have information on every bridge. And if you don't have the information, then you can't do Tier 2 assessment. Tier 2 and 3 assessment, Tier 3 assessments can be used to access heavy vehicles. But I really want to get this focus on the whole point of doing Tier 2 and Tier 3 assessment should be focused on developing relevant reference vehicles, or as I've described, percentage of reference vehicles suitable to do fast and accurate Tier 1 assessments. That's the whole point of doing Tier 2 assessments. And the whole point of doing Tier 3 assessments is to get better Tier 2 assessments. And all of that feeds into Tier 1 assessment. The selection of appropriate tiers of assessment obviously is dependent on the context. And as I've described, it may not be successive. It really depends on the context. That's what's really important through that process. Lastly, or not lastly, second lastly, the rapid Tier 1 assessment that I'm talking about. So it has the potential to be fast, cheap, quick turnaround times, automated, reliable. And what it can do is it can allow us to have consider many configurations and do this very rapidly. But for all of that to work, we have to have appropriate reference vehicles. Tier 2 assessment is one of the ways to get appropriate reference vehicles, but there are others. And I will cover that in the webinar on Thursday on Tier 1 assessment. Last point, really important point, Tier 1 assessment is heavy vehicle access assessment. It's not bridge assessment. When we get to Tier 2 and Tier 3 assessment, now we're talking about bridge assessment, right? Where we're actually assessing the capability of a bridge. Tier 1 assessment, all we're doing is comparing an application vehicle to some measure of what we think is okay already to cross the structure, right, which is the bridge capability. All right, so just a quick plug, like I always do in all these webinars. You know, a lot of this is covered in this assessing heavy vehicle access to bridges, which is a training course that's done by IPWIAC. We are looking at ways to roll this out into other states as well. So we'll keep you posted, but just keep an eye on this website for courses coming up. All right, well, I just wanted to say thanks very much for listening. I know it's a lot of information quick, but the more exposure you can get to this, the more it'll start to make sense. And I hope that's been helpful. So really happy to take some questions now, and obviously a quick plug for the next webinar on Thursday, 15th of July, where I'll be covering, that's on this Thursday, I'll be covering Tier 1 assessments in much more detail than what we've covered here. And of course, there's the registration link just there that you can click on, go register for that, and also for the remaining webinar series as well. So with that, I'll sign off from my talk, and I'll take some questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neil. Once again, some really good information there, and you can start to see that connection between the assessment and what it means for heavy vehicle access, which I think is really important. All right, no doubt you're all thinking of some questions or comments. So while you're doing that, load them up in the chat, but I'll jump in here and just see how we're going. I think Linda may have addressed one there from Rob initially in terms of uploading the report, so you can see that there. Raghu, we've carried out a number of Tier 2 assessments for our bridges. Tier 2 assessment reports suggest to carry out Tier 3 to find out the right treatment options for distress found in the structure. Is there any other options to find the treatment methodology considering the cost for Tier 3 assessment? Well, that's a good question. What would you say in regards to that question there, Neil?
Oh, geez, I was trying to think about my screen. Could you just repeat the question? So I was a bit...
Effectively what Raghu's saying is, you know, Tier 2s have been done, and there's clearly an issue in regards to, you know, the distress within the structure.
Yes.
So obviously the condition, going down the path of doing a Tier 3 is clearly an expensive exercise. What are the other options? And I suppose there's one here that we've included in our project, which probably is an option in these sorts of circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. I think that what's interesting is whenever you do a Tier 2 assessment, it comes up with poor results. If you've had a supplier do that Tier 2 assessment, inevitably they always suggest that you do a Tier 3 assessment. And generally, they're not really thinking about whether they could get to an outcome. They're often they're just digging up more work, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just the reality of how these processes work. Often there's not a lot of thought that goes into whether a tier 3 has the potential to get a good outcome. And so it's important that you don't just rely on the advice of that particular consultant. It could be worth going and having a chat to a few others, having a chat to a few people that you trust, in terms of getting some good advice. And so it's important to start to build up that network. Don't just go to the cheapest supplier. You've got to build your network of people that you can trust, that can provide you with advice that's relevant and useful. One of the processes that we look at in this strategic local government assessment program is we have this process of doing a structure improvement assessment, or asset improvement assessment. And what that process is about is trying to identify what the options are, because one of the things that I've always encouraged is that tier 3 assessment should only really be done when you're trying to answer a specific question. And if you don't know what the question is, then tier 3 can be quite challenging to come up with. All you end up with is more questions, which I touched on in my presentation. So if the structure is in really poor condition, the things that you need to be asking the consultant is, if we do tier 3 and we do this sorts of testing or assessment, can we get to a point where we could have a good outcome? Can we answer that question first? Or is it just, is there no chance? They're the sorts of questions that I would be encouraging you to ask. How long is the structure likely to last is a really important question, and you can get ballpark answers to this if you've got really good suppliers to make decisions before you go and spend money. We don't need the exact answer of it's going to last, 26 days. What we need to know is it going to last 50 years or is it going to last 20 years? Because that really affects whether we go down the path of repairing, strengthening, all those sorts of things. So understanding what your goals are becomes really important in that process. It's not just an automatic, let's go to the next level. Obviously, if you have some more specifics on that, we can get into that. I mean, it's fairly general question, so it's a fairly general answer. And like all things, context always matters.
Yes, as you say, it becomes an individual thing with each bridge, case by case, doesn't it, Neil? In a lot of circumstances. Right. So, all right, thanks, Neil. Thanks, Raghu. Got a question here from Carlos. Oh, well, this is a good question. Will all structures be assessed in the state?
No.
Or how will they be chosen for assessment? So, look, that's a really good question. And I'll just outline. We've done 2 rounds of assessments so far. So we did a pilot last year, and in that pilot, we assessed 100 structures across 12 council areas. And obviously that's not all the structures in those areas. We just asked the councils to nominate certain key structures. We actually went out to all local government road managers in about September last year, and again asked them to nominate their assets. So through that process, I think we had about close to 1,000 assets nominated, and that was across around about 80 odd councils. So while that's a good snapshot, obviously it's not everyone. And so far we're just wrapping up assessment of a further 200 of those assets through this round. So what that means is we've still got, a bank of about 800 assets that have been nominated by local governments in that last survey. Now, what we understand, and I say what we understand because the actual number isn't known because we don't have any central database for this, is that there's somewhere around about 20,000 bridges on local government roads nationally. So somewhere around that, and obviously culverts, which we've also looked at in this process as well. There's many more of those. Again, we don't know what the number is. So having outlined that and the time it's taken us to do 300, I think it's pretty fair the answer is no. If we had an endless bucket of money, we would probably say yes, in the fullness of time we will do it. And I think what's important, and Neil's touched on some of these concepts here, and I guess it's something that we've recognised when we've looked at the fact that by the end of, around about now, we've done around 300 assets in 18 months. So, drop in the ocean compared to the 20,000. So we recognise the limitations, the time it takes, the funding required to do that, and they've got to be done individually. Neil's touched on some concepts here around the rapid assessment, particularly at that tier 1 level, because the key thing there is about that relationship to heavy vehicle access requests, which is what you guys, one of your key roles under the HVNL, to assess those as they come in. So what we're actually looking at is some ways and methods of how we might be able to get greater reach across our bridge stock, recognising that we just simply can't go out and assess every single individual structure because of all those factors that Neil's outlined. So what we're going to be doing going forward is to work around we've got a prototype, and I did talk to this in the previous webinar, a prototype of a rapid assessment tool at the tier 1 level. So we've got a draft of that. We're going to play around with that over the next month, and then what we're hoping to do is make that available to local government. But we're also going to, I think this is really important, is build it into the NHVR portal, which is where heavy vehicle operators are and where you guys are to do your consent assessment. So we want to build that in there, and that's going to take some time. But the beauty of that is that it will then facilitate, when you get these applications coming in, the ability to actually run those vehicles that have been nominated for that on that application to be run through that tool and to effectively give you an answer. So that's the capability we're looking at building, recognising that we simply just can't assess everything. The other thing that we're talking about, and there's not a lot we can say about it at this stage other than we think there's quite a bit of potential to look at the various bridge families and then look at the behaviours of vehicles in relation to those different types of structures. So, and what we do know is that particularly across local government, we do have a lot of bridges that, are in certain families, and we know that within individual councils that a lot of bridges may have been replaced at a similar time, and they're quite a similar arrangement or articulation, I guess you could say, and dimension. So if we were to do an assessment on one of those, how can we then look at applying those results to the other, and I'll use the term loosely, the other similar structures? And at least then that way, that gives us some idea of the potential performance. Obviously, we need to know, and Neil made a really good point about this, and we can't emphasise it enough. We need to know the condition of the asset in which to do that. If we don't know the condition, it's a theoretical assessment, and we can't really apply it with a great deal of confidence. The other part of that is the design drawings, which Neil also was talking about. Absolutely critical that we have that information. So I guess to wrap that up, no, we're not doing every single one. We'd love to be able to, but we're not going to be able to. So we're looking at the rapid assessment tool, as well as looking at doing some analysis around bridge families to be able to apply that across. And I guess the other thing here is and Neil can probably comment more on this, is that I'd ask the question as to whether do we actually need to assess every single structure, and let's not forget what we already understand around our bridge stock and also about their performance and what's been running over them. So if you think about the consents that you've been issuing for certain vehicles, and those bridges haven't fallen down, if they had, we'd all know about it. Generally, they're performing okay. So, it really does beg the question, do we actually need to do that? Our focus going forward is going to be around the critical assets that are on the key heavy vehicle routes on the network. So that will be where our focus is. So I know that's a bit long-winded, Carlos, but hopefully that answers your question. All right, I'll keep moving here. We got Robert. Will round 2 of SLAAP funding be open soon for a new list of bridges and culverts? So yeah, good question. So and I suppose we'll just reiterate that point that we got additional funding from the Australian government for a further 3 years to continue this program of work. So another $12 million in funding. As I said, we've already got about 700 or 800 assets that we haven't even looked at as yet. So we need to revisit that. But the key thing here is that we're going to be looking at is making sure that we're putting given that we can't do all of them, that we're putting energy into the most important assets around the place. So the ones where they're more important on the network and to heavy vehicle access. So that will be our focus, and we'll be doing some analysis of the data that we have in order to identify those assets. So once we've worked through that over the next few months, we'll then be coming back to you to let you know how that process is going to run out. The other tip I guess I'd give you is that in our conversations with the Australian government, there is a great deal of interest in terms of, economic and network outcomes. So as a result of that, our focus is going to shift more from just individual councils nominating their assets to looking at regions. And I know, everybody falls within either it's a ROC or some form of other roads group where you do work together, you've got strategic documents, you've identified your routes, and through that process we want to tap into where those most important assets are in your region. So that'll be a key thing working forward, and again, we'll be talking with the regional groups to progress that. So there's some of the indications of what we're going to be doing going forward. Thanks, Robert. Carmen, our Tier 2 assessments utilise assessment vehicles 1G to 8H as per the DTMR assessment criteria. Can you use this information for assessment of OSM loads, i.e. low loader with large indivisible loads? Neil, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Carmen, yeah, absolutely. You'll have a very good foundation for doing that kind of work with that load set, because that load set that TMR has there includes in-lane vehicles, quite a large range of in-lane vehicles actually, and also straddling lane vehicles, like I think vehicle 5 is the HLP 320 load. So you'll definitely have a good range of vehicles that you can undertake Tier 1 assessment. There will be a couple of little issues just to become a little bit aware of, and that was just that issue around, having, I talked about in Tier 2 assessment that, I always encourage the accompanying vehicles to be the same vehicle. The DTMR assessment criteria as it currently stands has what they call route MCVs. I believe that potentially that might change in the future, going to more a consistent, same vehicle in both lanes. So there are a few small issues just to work through there, but fundamentally that information will be very useful to do that and will enable you to do good Tier 1 assessment. We have a similar process in the Strategic Local Government Access Assessment Program, where we've defined a series of, I think, 20 reference vehicles. Now, at the end of the day, the number of reference vehicles, both in the TMR criteria and the number of vehicles that we've specified, is overkill for what you actually need. But one of the key reasons why we've done that in this program is that there are a few things that we just need to do a little bit of research on. And so we've made sure that we've comprehensively got a good set of reference vehicles that we can do that research on, because as Todd said, we can't assess all these structures, and I agree with everything that he said there. We need to find ways of upscaling results for different bridge families and be confident that we can compare certain vehicles to other vehicles. And a lot of that work I've been involved with previously through Austroads projects, which shows very good correlation with Tier 1 assessment when you are looking at in-lane vehicles. But we haven't, and I think that would extend to straddling lane vehicles, but we haven't looked at the case where we could compare straddling lane vehicles to 2 in-lane vehicles. And that's something that we're trying to address in this program, and the reason why we have quite a lot of reference vehicles in that set. Generally you shouldn't need more than probably 3 to 5 vehicles when you're doing Tier 2 assessment is where I think it will end up. But certainly in our program, we've got a little bit to go there. And I think that, potentially in the future, you'll see a revision to some of those requirements that are published by other organisations as well. But certainly you've got a great load set to start with.
I think an important point just on the end of that in terms of defining the reference vehicles, Neil, perhaps people aren't aware, but generally when you've got your design drawings for the bridge design, you're generally going to only have one or two vehicles that are specified as the design vehicle.
Yeah.
Hence why we then need to go and define what these other vehicles are. So normally you might have a B double. If it's a HLP, you might have that vehicle specified as well, but
Yeah.
it doesn't cover off, particularly with the proliferation of vehicles on the road these days, it doesn't cover off some of those other key sort of configurations, hence why we need to, I guess, pad that out from the original design vehicles.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, no, I agree.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. And look, thanks everyone for your questions. So that's been a really good session. I think some key points in there. And again, I think, look, you know, in the context of what we're doing here, I think it's really, really important that you understand the concepts around the technical, some of the technical aspects, and understand how that assessment is undertaken. But when it comes to actually doing your heavy vehicle access decision making, you know, there are other factors to consider. And as Neil pointed out, there's this thing called plausibility. So there can be cases where what's happened in the assessment and the results you've got don't actually match what's happening in reality. And that's quite a common thing. So we don't just look at the results of the assessment and then throw everything else out. We have to consider all of it. So those assessment results are another input for you to be able to make your judgment and make your decision. So we consider all of those things. And I think that's a really, really important point that everybody needs to understand. All right. Well, thank you. We're over time. Thanks for your attendance. As Neil mentioned, the next exciting webinar in the series is on Thursday. So make sure you register for that one. What are we talking about again? Is it the
Tier 1 assessment this week?
Tier 1 assessment, which is, as Neil pointed out, really, really important for local government road managers, and it's going to be a key focus. So please, if you can, make sure you can join that session. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next session. Have a good day.
Everyone.
Bye for now.